Sauron's story begins in the depths of time, long before he became the Dark Lord feared throughout Middle-earth. He was one of the Ainur, a class of divine spirits created by Eru Ilúvatar, the supreme being in Tolkien's legendarium. These Ainur were immensely powerful beings, akin to angels, each embodying different aspects of creation. Among the Ainur were two main groups: the Valar, who were the mightiest of the Ainur and oversaw the shaping of the world, and the Maiar, who were lesser but still immensely powerful spirits who served the Valar. Sauron was originally known as Mairon and was one of the Maiar. Mairon was drawn to Aule, the Vala of craftsmanship, smithing, and creation. Aule was responsible for the crafting of the physical world and taught many of the Maiar the arts of creation and design. Under Aule's tutelage, Mairon developed a deep love for order, structure, and precision. He was fascinated by the intricate ways in which the world could be shaped, molded, and refined, and he became an unparalleled craftsman and smith. In his early days, Mairon was not motivated by darkness or evil. His desire for perfection stemmed from a genuine appreciation of beauty and utility, and he saw order as the ultimate manifestation of divine will. As Mairon honed his skills, he became obsessed with the concept of perfection. He saw flaws in the world, imperfections that could be corrected through design and control. In his mind, chaos was anathema to creation, and he believed that only through strict order could the world achieve its true potential. Mairon's pursuit of perfection was not inherently evil, but it was this drive that would later be twisted into something darker. His love for order and structure, while initially pure, began to transform into a desire for control, not just over objects and creations, but over all living things. It was this growing obsession with control that made Mairon susceptible to the influence of Melkor, the mightiest of the Valar. Melkor, who would later be known as Morgoth, had once been the greatest of Eru Ilúvatar's creations. However, his lust for power and dominion led him to rebel against the other Valar and Eru Ilúvatar himself. Melkor sought to bend the world to his will, twisting it into a reflection of his own dark desires. He was a being of immense power, but unlike Aule, Melkor did not seek to create and perfect. He sought to dominate and destroy. When Melkor first approached Mairon, he recognized in him a kindred spirit. Although Mairon had not yet embraced evil, his desire for control and order made him vulnerable to corruption. Melkor offered Mairon a vision of power that resonated deeply with him, a world where all things were controlled and shaped according to a single unified order, an order that they would impose. Melkor presented himself not as a destroyer, but as the one who could bring true order to the world, an order that transcended the messy, imperfect reality created by the Valar. Mairon was seduced by this vision. He did not join Melkor out of a love for destruction or chaos. On the contrary, he abhorred such things, but because he believed that Melkor's path offered the only way to achieve the perfection and control he craved. Thus, Mairon became Melkor's most trusted lieutenant, taking on a new name, Sauron. As Sauron, he played a crucial role in Melkor's rebellion against the Valar. Unlike many of Melkor's other servants who were mere creatures of brute force or beings who reveled in destruction, Sauron remained focused on his ideals of order and control. He brought a level of intelligence and cunning to Melkor's cause that made him invaluable. While Melkor often acted impulsively, driven by his immense power and rage, Sauron was calculated. methodical. He sought to impose his vision of order on the world through manipulation, strategy, and precise action. Sauron's relationship with Melkor was more than that of a servant to a master. He truly believed in Melkor's cause, seeing in his rebellion the opportunity to bring the world under a single unified dominion. To Sauron, the world was fundamentally flawed, chaotic, and imperfect. Melkor's vision of domination seemed like the only way to impose true order upon it. In this way, Sauron was not merely a follower. He was a disciple, someone whose own ambitions were magnified and expanded through Melkor's dark ideology. As the First Age of Middle-earth unfolded, Sauron played a pivotal role in Melkor's war against the Valar and the Elves. He was instrumental in leading Melkor's armies, creating fortresses, and spreading fear across Middle-earth. One of his most significant accomplishments during this time was the construction of Angband, a vast fortress that served as Melkor's primary stronghold after the destruction of Utumno. Sauron was also a master of sorcery and dark magic, creating terrifying creatures and bending them to Melkor's will. Despite his growing power, Sauron always remained in Melkor's shadow. He served his master without question, for Melkor was the ultimate embodiment of the power Sauron sought. Together, they wrought devastation upon the world, causing the ruin of many of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Sauron's cunning and intelligence made him an invaluable asset to Melkor's cause, and his loyalty was unwavering. He truly believed that through Melkor's vision, they could reshape the world according to their will, bringing about a new era of dominance and control. However, the tides of fortune shifted with the War of Wrath, the final great battle of the First Age. After centuries of conflict, the Valar and their allies, most notably the Elves and the forces of men, finally rose against Melkor in full force. The devastation caused by this war was immense, as the combined power of the Valar clashed with Melkor's forces. Sauron played a key role in this conflict, commanding armies and wielding his dark powers to terrible effect. But even Sauron's formidable abilities were not enough to prevent Melkor's ultimate defeat. The Valar overwhelmed Melkor's forces, and in the climactic moments of the war, Melkor was captured and cast into the void, a timeless prison beyond the confines of the world. His defeat marked the end of the First Age and the beginning of a new era for Middle-earth. With Melkor's fall, Sauron found himself in an unfamiliar position. For the first time in millennia, he was without his master. Melkor, who had been the source of his power and ambition, was gone, and Sauron was left to chart his own course. In the immediate aftermath of Melkor's defeat, Sauron fled into hiding. He knew that the Valar, having triumphed over Melkor, would now turn their attention to rooting out his remaining followers, and Sauron was not willing to face their judgment. During this time, Sauron was offered a chance to repent. The Valar, in their mercy, extended an offer of forgiveness to him, much as they had done with other Maiar who had been corrupted by Melkor. But Sauron's pride and ambition were too great. While he had once served Melkor out of loyalty and a shared vision, now that his master was gone, Sauron's own hunger for power began to take precedence. The thought of submitting to the Valar, of renouncing the dark path he had walked for so long, was unthinkable to him. Instead of repenting, Sauron chose to go into hiding. He withdrew into the shadows, biding his time and waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. While the world believed him to be defeated and scattered, Sauron was far from gone. He was a master of deception and patience, and he knew that his time to rise again would come. In the years that followed Melkor's defeat, Sauron's ambitions began to evolve. No longer content to merely serve as the right hand of another, he began to see himself as the rightful ruler of Middle-earth. His early years in hiding were spent gathering knowledge, expanding his power, and formulating new plans. He was no longer the lieutenant of Morgoth. He was now the Dark Lord in his own right. During this period, Sauron's mastery of manipulation became one of his greatest strengths. While Melkor had ruled through brute force and terror, Sauron preferred subtler methods. He was a master of deceit, able to present himself as a figure of wisdom and authority, earning the trust of others before betraying them. This cunning approach allowed him to slowly rebuild his power without drawing the immediate attention of the Valar or the Elves, who believed the dark days of Melkor's reign were over. Without Melkor, Sauron was faced with a crucial decision. Should he continue to serve the vision of his former master, or should he carve out his own path to power? The remnants of Melkor's empire were scattered and leaderless, and Sauron knew that the time was ripe for him to assert his dominance. He began to consolidate his power, using his knowledge of sorcery, craft, and manipulation to lay the foundation for his eventual rise. Sauron's ambitions had shifted. No longer was he simply Morgoth's lieutenant, content to carry out another's will. He now sought to impose his own vision of order and control upon the world. This marked the beginning of Sauron's transformation into the Dark Lord that would come to haunt Middle-earth for ages to come. During the Second Age of Middle-earth, Sauron's ambitions began to take on a new, more sophisticated form. No longer content to merely survive in the aftermath of Morgoth's fall, he sought to rebuild his power and claim dominion over the world. Sauron understood that brute force alone would not be sufficient to achieve his goals. Morgoth had ruled through terror and destruction, but Sauron, ever the master of subtlety and manipulation, recognized that there were more effective ways to control the peoples of Middle-earth. Sauron realized that the elves, the most powerful and wise of Middle-earth's inhabitants, would need to be brought under his sway if he hoped to dominate the world. The elves had fought against Morgoth and his forces during the First Age, and they remained strong and vigilant even after his defeat. Sauron knew that a direct assault on them would be costly and likely unsuccessful, so he turned to deception. Disguising his true nature, Sauron adopted a fair and wise form, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. In this guise, he approached the elves, particularly those in the region of Eregion, who were known for their skills in crafting and their close relationship with the Valar Aule, whom Sauron had once served. Among the elves of Eregion was Celebrimbor, the greatest smith of his time and a descendant of Fëanor, the legendary elf who had created the Silmarils. Sauron, in his guise as Anatar, presented himself as a benevolent figure who wished to share his knowledge of crafting and creation with the elves. He spoke of his desire to help them create wonders that would elevate their people to new heights of power and beauty. The elves, who still remembered the devastation of the First Age and sought to preserve their realms from the ravages of time, were intrigued by Anatar's offers. Celebrimbor, in particular, was drawn to Anatar's knowledge and wisdom, and the two began to collaborate on the creation of powerful magical artifacts. It was through this collaboration that the Rings of Power were forged. Under Anatar's guidance, Celebrimbor and his fellow smiths crafted a series of rings, each imbued with great power. These rings were intended to preserve and enhance the realms of the elves, allowing them to maintain their lands in a state of eternal beauty and prosperity. However, Sauron had a darker purpose in mind. While the elves labored to create their rings of power, Sauron secretly forged a master ring, the One Ring, in the fires of Mount Doom. This ring was unlike the others. It was imbued with a portion of Sauron's own essence, and its purpose was to dominate the wearers of the other rings, and through them, the peoples of Middle-earth. Sauron's plan was to control the rulers of the elves, dwarves, and men, bringing all of Middle-earth under his dominion through the power of the One Ring. However, Sauron's plan did not unfold as smoothly as he had hoped. When he placed the One Ring upon his finger, the elves immediately became aware of his treachery. They sensed the dark presence of Sauron in the ring and realized that they had been deceived. In a desperate bid to prevent Sauron from controlling them, the elves removed their rings and refused to use them. Sauron, enraged by the elves' defiance, launched a war against them. He sought to claim the rings of power for himself and punish the elves for their rebellion. The conflict between Sauron and the elves was brutal, and many of the great cities of the elves, including Eregion, were destroyed. Celebrimbor, who had created the rings, was captured by Sauron and tortured until he revealed the locations of some of the rings. However, he never betrayed the location of the 3 rings that had been made for the elves, which had been hidden away to prevent them from falling into Sauron's hands. Despite this setback, Sauron managed to reclaim many of the rings of power, which he then distributed to other races in Middle-earth. He gave 7 rings to the dwarves and 9 to the kings of men, knowing that these races would be more susceptible to the corrupting influence of the rings. The dwarves, who were resistant to domination, used their rings to amass wealth, but they were not easily controlled by Sauron. However, the men who received the 9 rings were not so fortunate. Over time, they fell under the power of the One Ring, becoming the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, Sauron's most feared and loyal servants. The creation of the One Ring marked a significant turning point in Sauron's quest for power. With the ring, he became the most powerful force in Middle-earth, surpassing even the heights that Morgoth had once achieved. Sauron's dominion spread across vast territories, and he commanded legions of orcs, trolls, and other dark creatures, all of whom were bent to his will. His ambition to enslave all of Middle-earth under his rule was closer to reality than ever before. During this time, Sauron's priorities began to shift. While he had once served Morgoth and sought to further his master's goals of domination and destruction, Sauron was now fully invested in his own vision of conquest. Morgoth's legacy still loomed large in Sauron's mind, but he had grown into a ruler in his own right. His desire for control had outgrown the need to serve another, and he now sought to impose his own order on the world. Yet despite Sauron's rise to power, a lingering question remained. Did he still desire to release Morgoth from the void? Morgoth had been Sauron's master for millennia, and the two had shared a vision of a world dominated by darkness. But by the Second Age, Sauron had become a ruler in his own right, and it is possible that he no longer wished to serve anyone else, even Morgoth. The forging of the One Ring and Sauron's subsequent war against the elves demonstrated his desire for complete dominion over Middle-earth, a goal that was driven by his own ambitions rather than by any lingering loyalty to Morgoth. Unlike Morgoth, whose primary goal had been the destruction and corruption of all things, Sauron sought to rule and control. Morgoth had been a force of chaos and ruin, but Sauron, despite his evil, desired order. He wanted to bring all peoples and lands under his dominion, not to destroy them, but to shape them according to his will. This fundamental difference in their goals raises an important question. Would Sauron have wanted Morgoth's return, knowing that it could challenge his newfound authority? Sauron's ambitions were deeply personal by the time he established himself as the Dark Lord. Though he may have once revered Morgoth as the embodiment of ultimate power, his ultimate goal had evolved into the domination of Middle-earth through his own means. The creation of the One Ring was the clearest indication of this shift in his thinking. With the ring, Sauron no longer needed to rely on the power of another. He had crafted a tool that would allow him to control others directly, bending their wills to his own without the need for open conflict. It is true that Morgoth's return was prophesied in the distant future. In some of the more obscure writings of Tolkien's legendarium, there are hints of a dark prophecy known as the Dagor Dagorath, which foretells Morgoth's escape from the void and the final battle between good and evil at the end of the world. This prophecy spoke of a time when Morgoth would break free and wage one last war against the forces of good, bringing with him chaos and destruction on a scale never before seen. For Sauron, the prophecy of Morgoth's return may have held deep significance. As Morgoth's most loyal servant during the First Age, Sauron would have been well aware of the prophecy. The return of his master would signify the restoration of the dark vision they had once shared. However, by the time of the Second Age, Sauron was no longer the follower he once was. He had grown into a power of his own, and Morgoth's return could have posed a significant threat to his authority. If Morgoth were to return, he would undoubtedly reassert his dominance over all who served him, including Sauron. Morgoth's vision of domination was rooted in destruction, and his return would likely mean the unraveling of everything Sauron had worked to build. While Sauron sought to impose order and control, Morgoth's rule was characterized by chaos, ruin, and decay. The delicate balance of power that Sauron had created in Middle-earth would be shattered if Morgoth were to return and resume his conquest. It is possible that Sauron, despite his loyalty to Morgoth in the past, no longer desired his master's return. By the time he had established himself as the Dark Lord, Sauron had little to gain from Morgoth's resurgence. His authority, his dominion, and the careful web of control he had spun over Middle-earth would all be at risk. Morgoth's return could undermine everything Sauron had built, forcing him to once again serve as a lieutenant rather than as a ruler in his own right. However, the prophecy of Morgoth's return may have also been a source of fear for Sauron. Though he had surpassed Morgoth in many ways, especially in terms of influence over the peoples of Middle-earth, the return of his old master would represent a profound challenge to Sauron's vision of control. Morgoth, as the original Dark Lord, was a being of raw, destructive power. His return would almost certainly mean a return to chaos and destruction, a force that Sauron had sought to avoid by imposing his own form of order on the world. For Sauron, the idea of Morgoth's return may have been both a source of hope and a source of dread. On one hand, the return of Morgoth would signify the fulfillment of a dark destiny, the ultimate triumph of evil over good. On the other hand, it would mean that Sauron's own reign would come to an end, as he would once again be forced into the role of a servant, bowing to the will of a master who valued destruction over the careful control that Sauron so prized. By the time Sauron had fully established himself as the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, he had grown beyond the need for Morgoth's influence. His ambitions had become his own, shaped by his desire for complete control over the peoples and lands of Middle-earth. Though Morgoth's teachings had influenced Sauron's path, the two figures had fundamentally different approaches to their quest for power. Morgoth sought to corrupt and destroy the world, while Sauron sought to dominate and rule it. In the end, it is likely that Sauron had little interest in releasing Morgoth from the void, though the prophecy of Morgoth's return may have weighed heavily on his mind. Sauron's desire for control and self-rule had grown to surpass any lingering loyalty he felt toward his former master. By the time of his reign in Middle-earth, Sauron had become his own Dark Lord, with his own unique vision of how the world should be ruled. By the time the Second and Third Ages of Middle-earth unfolded, Sauron's vision of power had crystallized into something deeply personal and distinct from that of his former master, Morgoth. Sauron's ultimate ambition was not simply to dominate through brute strength as Morgoth had once done, but to establish a more calculated, far-reaching form of control. Sauron had observed the limitations of terror and raw power during his service to Morgoth, and he had learned from those experiences. He realized that the use of manipulation, deception, and the gradual corrosion of free will could create a far more enduring and stable form of dominance. Where Morgoth reveled in chaos and the complete annihilation of his enemies, Sauron sought to bring all beings under his will, to impose order and control over their very minds. This is why the One Ring became central to his strategy. The ring was not merely a weapon of power, it was an instrument of subjugation. By forging the One Ring, Sauron aimed to bind the rulers of Middle-earth, elves, dwarves, and men, to his will. He envisioned a world where free will no longer existed, where every being was an extension of his own desires, acting as instruments of his power. The One Ring was an extension of Sauron's very essence, imbued with a part of his soul and will. This was a profoundly significant act, as it made Sauron's power more concentrated and effective, but also more vulnerable. The ring amplified his ability to dominate and control, but it also tied much of his existence to its survival. Nonetheless, Sauron believed the benefits far outweighed the risks. With the ring, he could control the other rings of power, which had been distributed to the leaders of Middle-earth, particularly the 9 that were given to mortal kings. The men who received these rings, though initially exalted as great rulers, soon became wraiths, empty shells of their former selves, entirely bound to, Sauron's will. These Nazgûl, or ring wraiths, were Sauron's most loyal and feared servants. They embodied the kind of dominance Sauron sought, total control over their bodies, minds, and spirits. Unlike Morgoth's minions, who often acted out of fear or hatred, the Nazgûl had no wills of their own. They were entirely subsumed by Sauron's power, making them the perfect instruments of his will. During this period, Sauron's dominion spread across vast territories. He ruled not through the raw destruction that Morgoth had once unleashed, but through a complex network of fear, corruption, and control. Sauron's methods were insidious. He didn't just conquer lands. He sought to corrupt the very fabric of Middle-earth, bending its peoples to his will through cunning promises of power and wealth. This was particularly evident in the way he dealt with men, who were the most susceptible to his manipulations. Sauron exploited their greed, their fear of death, and their desire for power, turning many of them into willing servants of his dark rule. As Sauron's power grew, the question of Morgoth's return lingered in the background, though Sauron's ambitions had long since eclipsed the need for his former master. Morgoth had once been the supreme dark power in the world, but by the time Sauron had established himself as the Dark Lord, his vision was entirely his own. Morgoth's legacy, while foundational in shaping Sauron's early ambitions, was now only a distant shadow. Sauron had developed into a ruler who sought not destruction for its own sake, but domination through control. Even if Morgoth's return had been possible, it is unlikely that Sauron would have welcomed it. Morgoth's re-emergence would have threatened the very empire Sauron had spent centuries constructing. Morgoth, a being of raw, chaotic power, would have undermined Sauron's carefully crafted web of control and order. The world that Sauron wanted was one where everything was subjected to his will, where his rule was absolute and unchallenged. Morgoth, on the other hand, had always sought to corrupt and destroy rather than govern and maintain. Sauron's independence from Morgoth became most apparent when he established his fortress of Barad-dûr in the land of Mordor. Barad-dûr was not only a physical manifestation of Sauron's power, but also a symbol of his sovereignty. Here, Sauron ruled as the supreme Dark Lord, with armies of orcs, trolls, and other creatures at his command. He no longer needed to rely on the legacy of Morgoth to instill fear and respect. His own name became synonymous with terror and absolute power. By the Third Age, Sauron had grown far beyond the servant he had once been. His sense of self-importance and superiority were immense, bolstered by centuries of conquest and manipulation. He viewed himself as the rightful ruler of Middle-earth, and his pride in his abilities only grew with each victory. Sauron had learned to adapt to the changing circumstances of the world, surviving through multiple ages and building his power base when others might have been destroyed. This adaptability was one of the key differences between him and Morgoth. While Morgoth had relied heavily on sheer force and his overwhelming strength, Sauron had learned to play a longer, more subtle game, manipulating the various races of Middle-earth to serve his ends. Sauron's self-perception was also deeply tied to his role as the creator of the One Ring. The forging of the ring represented Sauron's ultimate desire for self-sufficiency and absolute authority. With the ring, he could ensure that he was not merely following in Morgoth's footsteps, but carving out his own path to dominion. The ring's power allowed him to control the rulers of Middle-earth without resorting to brute force, using their own greed and desire against them. This was a reflection of Sauron's more refined, calculated approach to evil, one that emphasized control over destruction. As the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, Sauron no longer needed to rely on anyone else's vision or power. He had become a force unto himself, feared and revered by his enemies and followers alike. The rings of power, particularly the One Ring, were the instruments through which he sought to dominate all of Middle-earth, bending it to his will. By this point, it is likely that Sauron would have viewed Morgoth's return as not only unnecessary, but a threat to his carefully crafted dominion. If Morgoth had returned from the void, it would have introduced an element of chaos that Sauron had long since sought to eliminate. Morgoth's return would have meant a resurgence of destruction and disorder, something that would have jeopardized the stability of Sauron's empire. While Morgoth had once been Sauron's master and inspiration, the relationship between the two had always been fraught with tension. Morgoth's obsession with destruction had never aligned perfectly with Sauron's need for control and order. By the time Sauron had established himself as the supreme Dark Lord, his ambitions had grown beyond the need to serve anyone else, even someone as powerful as Morgoth. Furthermore, Sauron's pride would have played a significant role in his reluctance to bring Morgoth back. By the Third Age, Sauron had surpassed Morgoth in many ways, particularly in his ability to manipulate and corrupt the peoples of Middle-earth. Morgoth had been defeated and cast into the void, but Sauron had managed to survive through multiple ages, constantly adapting and rebuilding his power. In Sauron's mind, he had achieved what Morgoth never could: lasting dominion over Middle-earth. Sauron had also come to value order and stability, even within his own dark rule. He wanted Middle-earth to thrive under his control, not be reduced to ruins. Morgoth's return would have threatened that vision, bringing with it a level of chaos that Sauron no longer desired. While Morgoth had sought to unravel creation itself, Sauron's version of evil was far more structured. He wanted to dominate and rule, not destroy. Morgoth's return would have disrupted everything Sauron had built, potentially turning Middle-earth back into the war-torn, desolate land that it had been during the First Age. It is also important to consider the practical limitations of releasing Morgoth from the void. Morgoth's banishment to the void was a result of the combined power of the Valar, and it is implied that only Eru Ilúvatar, the Supreme Creator, could release him. Even if Sauron had wanted to bring Morgoth back, he likely lacked the power to do so. This may have been another factor in Sauron's calculations. Knowing that Morgoth's return was beyond his control, Sauron focused on consolidating his own power, rather than dwelling on the possibility of his master's resurgence. That said, there may have been a lingering part of Sauron that still felt bound to Morgoth. Despite his pride and his desire for self-rule, Sauron had once been Morgoth's most loyal servant. He had spent millennia carrying out Morgoth's will, and his identity had been shaped by that service. Even in his later years, when Sauron had become a Dark Lord in his own right, there may have been a part of him that longed for the return of the original Dark Lord. The prophecy of Morgoth's return, as hinted at in some of Tolkien's early writings, may have been a source of both hope and fear for Sauron. On one hand, the return of Morgoth would mean the fulfillment of a dark destiny, the ultimate triumph of evil over good. But on the other hand, it would mean that Sauron's own reign would come to an end, as he would once again be forced to serve a master who valued destruction over control. Sauron's desire for order and dominion may have ultimately outweighed any lingering loyalty he felt toward Morgoth. By the time of his reign in Middle-earth, Sauron had grown into a Dark Lord who no longer needed to rely on Morgoth's legacy. He had crafted his own tools of domination, built his own empire, and become the supreme dark force in the world. Morgoth's return would have introduced a wild, uncontrollable element into Sauron's carefully constructed dominion, threatening to unravel everything he had worked for. In the end, Sauron's desire for control, order, and self-rule likely outweighed any thoughts of releasing Morgoth from the void. Though he had once served Morgoth with unwavering loyalty, Sauron's evolution into a ruler in his own right complicated that relationship. He had become his own Dark Lord, with his own unique vision of how the world should be ruled. The return of Morgoth would have challenged that vision, introducing chaos where Sauron sought to impose order. For these reasons, it is likely that by the time of his reign in Middle-earth, Sauron had little interest in releasing Morgoth from the void. Instead, he remained focused on his own path to absolute domination, one that no longer required the presence of his former master.